Thank you, by the way, just in advance for doing this.
No, this is, I think it's fun. I'll let you know afterwards. I knew as a young person I was interested in wild animals, conservation, and one of my earlier ape experiences was when I was a pre-veterinary student. No, actually, yeah, I was a veterinary student, and I was visiting at Yerkes Primate Center. And in that situation, the first time I visited, I was working in the reproductive biology lab, and we had a chance to work with apes every day, orang, gorilla, and chimps, and also bonobo. I got to see my first bonobo. And I met Sue there, actually. And so that was wonderful because we were anesthetizing animals, handling them. We were involved in artificial insemination processes, and all this kind of science was fun, and I was a student. So I had great exposure there, and you just can't help but fall in love with the chimpanzee, you know, and any of the great apes. They're just so interactive. They're so familiar. We had chimps in one area that we were using for the reproductive biology research, and I was in there as a student, and at that time I would smoke cigarettes. And there's a chimp sitting there at the front of the cage just staring at me and leaning into the cage, and I'm smoking my cigarette, and he's just looking at me, and of course now this would be inappropriate, but I had the butt just about, and I turned around and I gave it to the chimp, and obviously this wasn't the first time. I think the caretakers, and the chimp goes like this, and then he takes it and puts it out just like a human would into the cage, and I went, whoa, and I kind of stepped back and I go, this is too familiar. So, and I think I was enchanted from day one, and that kind of built it. And then every other experience, I found that, you know, people will say, as a veterinarian, what's your favorite animal group? Well, I like all representation from all the different groups, but overall, chimps are definitely an animal that I've always been really attracted to.
So you were exposed very early on to...
Relatively speaking, you know, I mean, of course, as a young person, you go to the zoos and you have the experience, but to have this kind of very intimate contact is a great thing. And I don't know about your own experience, but once you touch animals, there's a different connection. So as a veterinarian, you have the advantage that, unfortunately, it's under anesthesia often, but it's the first time to really just touch an animal and explore. And I've always enjoyed kind of contemplating form and function, and how do these animals, how are they built to live and exist in a particular eco-niche or environment. And you know, there's a great model there. So I think that's, touching for me is sealing the deal. I think just to be able to explore the animal physically, and you start at the head, you look at every part of them, and it's not like I'm not a formal anatomist in training, but in veterinary medicine we get a lot of comparative anatomy, and again, I think that's part of the diversity impetus for me wanting to be a veterinarian. Was I saw the beauty in that diversity, and then all of a sudden you're actually physically touching an animal of this grandeur, you know, and you look at their teeth, you explore their body, and you realize how familiar and similar they are, and you start to gain a different kind of appreciation that, you know, Mother Nature didn't just create me. It's the same as when you first travel, I think. When I first traveled across the sea and I was in other communities, you go, oh my gosh, you know, this is possibly what it was like in the US maybe 50 years ago, or I might think, wow, you know, I'm living my life and growing up totally oblivious of these people and their struggles and their life in another place. And it's the same thing with, here I am touching another animal and connecting, and then from that point on you have a different regard, in my mind, for me. So in the course of the veterinary program at our school at the University of Missouri, they would allow you periods to go and explore a special interest. So for me, it was always running to some kind of zoo program. The first one was the Yerkes Primate Center. Then I went from zoo to zoo, and in each case, you develop further exposure, because most every zoo has some form of grade ape, and typically chimpanzees are one of the most obvious and notable and familiar. And then I went back to Yerkes again, but I worked at the St. Louis Zoo, the San Antonio Zoo, I worked at the San Diego Zoo, and the Yerkes 2 times, and that was just before graduating. San Diego had bonobos.
Yeah,
and St. Louis has never had bonobos, but they have chimpanzees, of course. And, you know, it was just something I was naturally attracted to. While I was in St. Louis, I was first there as a student, and there you're just kind of covering all opportunities, and they're teaching you and exposing you to all species. But when I went back later as a resident, after I did an internship in small animal medicine, then I went back as a resident at the St. Louis Zoo, I believe it was 1984 through 86. Then I was responsible as a clinical veterinarian to take care of all the critters and turn the chimps. And at the same time, I was fortunate that they were building their first grade ape facility, grade ape home. So I was able to kind of see that process in motion and more exposure to the animals. The chimps at that time were kept only in back housing and also exhibit housing. They had no exposure to the outside. And they only had a yard for the gorillas at that time. And I think one thing that was kind of sad to me was when I first went into the gorilla chamber and the chimpanzee chambers, it looks natural, right? It's all designed to look natural, but everything was hard and concrete, and no matter what they try and do to make it look soft, until they put the hay down, it's not soft. And you realize in the wild that they don't know what these hard textures are other than the tree. So then you realize there's only so much that we humans can do to mimic their setting, and that's both a fallacy and I think a shortcoming in captive care, is that we can only sometimes do so much. And their time outside is limited, and depending on the geographic area and the seasonality that's available, and time and managing the animals. They have to come in at night, you know. So there's lots of aspects of captive management that kind of inhibit the naturalness of holding and keeping apes. When you get to a program like we've seen in Festus with a private owner that has chimps, what they do, what they offer that you don't get in most of the formal programs, they have the intimacy, the contact, right or wrong. I mean, there's arguments to both sides, but I think they provide natural enrichment in their relationship with the ape that you don't get in typically at a captive zoo or research facility. And people don't want to look at that and see, they think that's, well, we don't let chimps, we want chimps to just be chimps, but they're not being chimps in a zoo world. In fact, one of my very good friends who's studied gorillas in the wild, Mike Fay, I don't know if you know him, but He's a National Geographic explorer, and he did his work, graduate work with gorillas in Central African Republic. And when he was invited to go to the Dallas Zoo, they had just opened up a new gorilla facility. And I said, well, how'd you like it? He goes, you know, Doug, two things. I just didn't look at them as wild gorillas. They didn't look the same. You know, and he said, in some cases I had to look to see that they were truly gorillas. And if you think about this, it's very simple. An analogy would be domestication of turkeys or peacocks. If you see a turkey on a farm, it's big and plump and it's not what Mother Nature created. You see one in the wild, it's lean and mean. I saw the same thing with peacocks in Southeast Asia. You know, I was used to seeing these big, bulbous animals with the beautiful tails. And in the wild, you see these streamlined, racing animals. And this is what domestication does. It changes things. We change the form of these animals that we manage. Inadvertently, but we do. So, you know, these are, I guess, points that could support arguing that animals belong in the wild and in their natural state when and if possible. Now, I do believe that keeping chimps and bonobos, these animals that are in captivity, or any of the other animals, in fact, is a way to reach a great number of people, the general population, to become sensitized and empathetic, sensitive, and interested in supporting these animals because it's their only contact and their only exposure. So there is an educational component that can then translate into financial support or just consideration that you wouldn't normally get. And that can be a city dweller as well as somebody in a rural setting. So there's value there to a point. But for, again, my own personal opinion, for zoos to consider themselves the culmination of great conservation actions, I just don't see it that way.
But when you worked at the St. Louis Zoo, were they still making the performances of chimpanzees, or was it already over?
Oh, good point. So let me backtrack. So I did have an earlier exposure when I was, before I got into veterinary school, I was going to a school in southern Florida called Florida International University. And I was kind of waiting and applying to vet school. In the meantime, I began working at Monkey Jungle in Goulds, Florida. And this was an established facility, and it was really interesting. My first real exposure to chimps. And, you know, I learned things like I saw, you know, one chimp pull a hose with his finger like this against 5 or 6 adult people, and it was nothing for him, you know. And we also had a show there, and it was about as basic as it could be. And it was funny because they had an elder black man that was the trainer, and it was all based on older training methods, and it was pretty fierce. You know, if the chimp didn't do what he was supposed to do, he got a whopping. It was always behind the scenes. But you could see the fear in one sense of the chimps, but you could also see their natural impish character. So I'd be sitting behind the stage, facing the audience. He'd be on the stage working a particular chimp to do tricks. And you would see every moment the chimp got, he would look to me and smile or some kind of expression like, hey, let's do something wrong here. And this guy, who was very kind of an unsophisticated, uneducated person that did his job, would have nothing of it. You know, you either toe the line or you're in trouble. So that was my very first, you know, contact experience with the chimps. And that show situation was not great. Now, when I went to the zoo, St. Louis Zoo, the first time, I'm remembering these stories now, but I went to the chimp house, the primate house, and I was in back, and I met one of the keepers who had been there since Vietnam. He was a black gentleman, never been around apes. He came to the zoo to work there as this person, as a keeper. And at that time, the St. Louis Zoo was manned mostly by many South County German people, these kind of husky big guys and kind of no-nonsense guys, and they did the chimp show there. And the first day he was there, you know, they're all playing cards, and he said, oh, it's time to feed the chimp. So he gets a bucket, and he puts the monkey chow in there, and he starts to walk towards the cages. And the other gentleman said, "No, Terry, hold on. We don't do it that way." And they pulled out one of the show chimps, and the show chimp went around throwing biscuits to all the chimps along the aisles. And Terry just said, he just looked and said, "Okay." So, exploitation, I guess, in a different way. You know, most of it, as I remember, were being able to ride a bike, being dressed up in human form, you know, walking a tightrope. It was more physical kind of activities rather than interactive learning or communication. It was really, you just do this. And I think that was the nature of the entertainment space at that time, is that whether it was a dolphin or whatever it was, you know, you just do these pointed kind of exercises. And that's the easiest. In those times, and with the sophistication of what these chimps could do, was lacking. I think the understanding was lacking, and they felt like, here's what we can do. We can teach them like a dog to roll over and this kind of stuff. But no one ever thought, I believe, to try and communicate in a different way and get a different expression. It was a 2-year residency.
2 years.
And there you're serving as one of the active clinical veterinarians, and you do everything and anything. And so whatever the opportunity is. If we do a procedure, let's say a health procedure, we're going to obviously, in most cases, have to sedate or anesthetize the animal to get close, to collect biological samples, to do an examination, to do special diagnostics. Now, more and more animals in zoos and other holding areas are being trained to accept a shot, even a blood draw, and obviously that, I think that's better. We had at the Fort Worth Zoo, I was the first full-time veterinarian, so I developed the program. We established my second opportunity to watch a primate building being built, and I helped bring bonobos there too, but we had a male gorilla that came in, but he was losing weight, he wasn't reacting right, we were really concerned. So this is another kind of common activity at zoos. We don't do some of these procedures every day, right? So we go out and reach out to the human community where there's so much specialization that they can really help you do things. So we decided we're going to knock this, we use that term, we're going to knock the gorilla down, which means we're going to anesthetize him. We use blow darts, we anesthetize him, we bring him into a surgical room that we have it all set up, and we had, I believe, 2 anesthesiologists, human anesthesiologists there. We had a cardiologist, we had a gastroenterologist, what else did we have? 1 or 2 other specialties, and we did a complete review. We scoped an endoscopy. We found out that in fact he had an ulcer, and it was probably the stress of the move and the new setting and the new cage and new animals he had to be around. After that, we were able to treat him more correctly, and that workup probably was a $50,000 to $100,000 workup. Of course, it was all free because these people, the medical field, they love the opportunity to do something different, but still within the scope of their specialty capabilities. So it's a beautiful blending. Now, more and more, we're getting the specialization within the veterinary community to help us do that, but still, in the zoo world, we would bring dentists in, human dentist or periodontist to help us with the care of these animals until our own science is catching up to that. And then, after that event, we went ahead and I brought a psychiatrist in to see this animal. And we had already had all the other evidence and diagnostics accomplished. And this guy I thought was stranger than the gorilla, actually, but he determined that, in fact, the animal was depressed. So at that time, Prozac was fairly new. We put him on Prozac. He got well. And it was just beautiful. It's a great story to mirror that the animal life forms are not that dissimilar. And I've always practiced that way when I tell people, you know, I had veterinary compadres in class that would say, well, I'm just going to work with dairy cattle, or I'm just going to do this and that. And I thought, how can you just do that when here's this wonderful diversity that we're being introduced to? Now, we don't get that much training. We have to go out and reach for it ourselves. But, you know, this is just an amazing opportunity to work with different species. later, when I was finishing about halfway through my residency at the St. Louis Zoo, I was invited into a graduate studies in primatology, anthropology at Washington University, and I had two sponsors who were both field folks. One worked with Ethiopian baboons, and the other fellow worked with lemurs in Madagascar. So they introduced me to an opportunity to go and work at a Smithsonian Institute site that had been studied visually. They'd been studying these toque macaques, and this was in Sri Lanka, and they were working with them for over 30 years and understanding the motion and activities of the different groups. They had like 600 monkeys in their field site in the forest, and it was really a beautiful area. It was up in the Polonnaruwa was the country, it was the city, and it was a site of Buddhist and Hindu ruins, and the jungle had enveloped this, and then there were little farm communities around it. So it was pretty impressive. They had the Smithsonian site. The Smithsonian was really an interesting organization because way back when, they were the first one to go into a country site, and what they wanted to do was establish ongoing long-term research facilities, and they would subsidize those, but then they would also take indigenous young students and train them into PhD students. And then they would put them back in their own field, in their own area. And that still is an amazing model that, you know, kind of was lost, and now I think that it has value again. So that now, those people would be the ones that were principally responsible to sustain a research or a protected site. But they always had the support of a Western world finance resource and other talents. And this particular site, we were studying these monkeys, and the year before they had gone out in the summer, and they were there about 3 or 4 months and tried to trap, sedate, and then they were collecting biological samples, metrics, they were measuring body parts, and they were working with like 14 different studies around the world. So if it was a blood sample to go to a genetics lab or to a biochemistry lab, or fecal material going to study parasites, or milk from lactating females would go to the National Zoo for those studies, on and on and on. And they tried to do this on their own without veterinary support. They lost some animals, they didn't know what they were doing. In the course of 4 months, I think they said they successfully anesthetized and trapped like 64 animals, and they needed more. So I went back on behalf of the Smithsonian, and then Columbia University professor there, Don Melnick, was a geneticist and anthropologist, and he had some grad students that he sent along, and the whole idea was to collect enough sample to allow them to do these studies, to understand how these large groups, small groups would fuse and fission out over time, and what was the relatedness between these animals. And now, in the meanwhile, they had 4 Sri Lankan field attendants that were not formally trained on the site, and they had an index card for each one of their groups, and they knew each individual by facial recognition or some kind of pigment on the skin, and anytime a new baby was born, they would follow that, and they knew all these animals. It was amazing. But now we were able to collect, and so we were able to trap in the same time period the next year, and I brought 2 students. One was a WashU primatology grad student, and I was a grad student too, but I was a veterinarian, so I had that experience. And we brought one lady from the National Zoo who was working there, and we collected in the same time period over 600 primates. Didn't lose a single one, anesthetized every one of them. And we did this, I set up this mobile camp. It was the first opportunity for the solar panels in little forms that would drive your computer. And so I set up a lab out in the middle of the jungle, and I had battery-run centrifuges and everything. It was great. And the geneticists had provided something called fast blood, which would sustain DNA for up to 30 days at room temperature, ambient temperature. So, I mean, yeah, this just opened up the world. So we did accomplish at least one PhD through that work for one of his students, so that was great. But it was also an opportunity. That's what got me very interested in field work, was to be able to mobilize everything. So I walk into the country with all this equipment, and kind of a funny aside was I didn't know what it was going to be like to have to bring drugs in and a blow dart and all this kind of stuff I was creating. So what I would do, I know it sounds kind of horrible, but I would go to the dime store. I'd write up a document on some pretty textured paper, and then I'd buy those little children's seals, and I'd put seals on them and sign them, and then I would take wax and I would close it up and wax it shut, like in Europe, and I would hand these documents to the people in charge in the customer, whatever the organization was, and they'd, oh gosh, we have to let you through. They didn't know what it said. But I did that several different actions and events when I traveled around the world. The difference is that when you're working with monkeys, you always feel like you're working with more of a group. Now this is in captivity. So when you're working with apes, it's more often individuals or a very small 1, 2, or 3 group setting. So it's a different kind of collective experience. And then being in, well, I didn't get to work with the great apes in the wild, kept hoping to, but in my experience with a lot of the smaller the monkeys was that I got to work with them and touch them in the wild. So that was an added benefit. And we saw so many interesting things. You see wounds that are so dramatic you would have thought it would have killed an animal, and yet they heal. And it gives you an appreciation of biological specimens' ability to heal, ourselves included. You just see them surviving with amazing compromises. And you learn, just learn passively. You learn more about the natural history, the movement of the animals through the forest and what they're searching for. They're looking for resources. They move to this tree, to that tree, whatever. And so it just gives you more of an awareness of, how these animals survive in here. I didn't get that opportunity with the great apes. I wanted to. In fact, I had planned, after I developed my darting system, to work with gorillas in the wild, and because at that time no one was darting them, or the apes either. I actually searched out and met the first, and probably at that time the only veterinarian. He was in Kansas City. He was about 90-something years old, and I found a picture of him and a reference to him in a book, great ape book, and he was still there, and we talked on the phone, and he was the first person to anesthetize a gorilla in the wild, and had a picture of him with that. And I wanted to go meet him, and I never got a chance to, long past, but that was kind of where I was going with all this, that I wanted to be the guy to go to get out in the field. I explored opportunities to go to the mountain gorillas, and I had invitations to do that, and there was always something else going on that I couldn't do that. But yeah, I'd go back and try and do more, and hopefully with the programs in the Congo, that would be an opportunity for me. It's interesting. I was talking to someone the other day, they were talking about an incident where the gorilla, a baby had fallen into a zoo pit, and they shot the gorilla. And I said, you know what? In my heart of hearts, I don't believe that gorilla would have ever damaged that baby. And I don't think an orangutan would either. I don't know about chimps. It would just depend on the dynamic of the moment, I think, whether a particular male was threatened or whatever. But I guess what I'm getting at is that I do see differences. I don't know the scientific basis for that, but generally I find that the great apes all are very interested in humans, and I don't think their first impression is to try and hurt them. I really think that they're more, now they may threaten, they may do lots of crazy things, and you've seen yourself in captivity, they throw poop, whatever, but I think that a lot of that's show. And unless you threaten them or back them to a certain situation, I really think in most cases they're going to explore you as much as you want to explore them. Again, the orangutans I always think of as kind of, solitary figures, and they're just their own person, you know what I mean? And they're so, they feel so sure of themselves. It's like they don't seem to have any of that kind of apprehensions. They're just there and, come on, grab me, I'll do whatever you want. But they don't seem to have that kind of barrier of concern that you might see in a gorilla. And I think a gorilla has even more bluff than even the chimps do. And the chimps, again, are different because I think there's so much more of a dynamic, interactive thing ongoing all the time, whether you're in captivity and what I understand in the wild, that they're encouraged to behave differently by a lot of different stimuli. But again, collectively, they're all just wonderful, amazing, and I want to go back to Yerkes. When I was a student, I'll never forget, the one thing I enjoyed most was they had a big breeding program for all three of the great apes, or the four, including Bonobo, and I would get to go into the nursery, and they had a big nursery room, and I'd sit down, and then they'd open the door, and in would rush in orang babies, chimp babies, a little gorilla baby, and they just all over you, and they're just, it's like, what a rush, and I don't forget those moments. They're just so special. Why? I don't know. It's just because that they're trusting me, and I'm trusting them, and again, you get to hug something, and Connie tells me all the time, I love my kids, I raise my kids, but there's nothing like hugging a chimp, a baby chimp. And maybe because they're so dependent on you. In the large emerald wing at the Yerkes Center, they had the apes, all of them there, and we went up and I was just exploring. There was this one little male orangutan that I was just in love with. It was just so cute. They had that cartoon face, right? So I'm sitting there rubbing his tummy, and I'm thinking, I'm getting along with him so well. And all of a sudden, I feel something warm. I look down, and he's peeing on me on my chest, and you can't do anything but giggle. There was a story I remember. I went and visited a bunch of zoos in East England that were owned by the famous entrepreneur Aspinall, and he had a whole different theory about managing zoos. He broke every rule. He had 6 foot of hay in the cages as a cushion. Most people would say, well, that's going to breed fungal infections and this and that. He took his grandchild, his baby, into the cage. It was a newborn. Gave it to one of his females. And she took it to the top of the cage. Didn't hurt it. She just held it. She protected it. Now, they recognize immediately that humans don't know how to clean. So they protect against that. And it's just a natural instinct. I'm going to help this baby. They don't just drop it. And I thought that was really an amazing feat of trust. It just was pretty amazing. But again, it says a lot about what these animals are about. They're not monster animals ready to destroy and kill. They have social organizations. They have family. They have a lot more human, maybe I should say we have a lot more ape characteristics and features in our social structure than we want to give them credit for.